Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the year 1912, traveling to the small town of Villisca, Iowa. It is a place of rolling hills and whispering cornfields, a community where the rhythm of life was dictated by the rising sun and the chiming bells of the local clock tower. On this particular evening, the 9th of June, the air was heavy with the humid embrace of early summer. The scent of damp earth and blooming peonies drifted through the streets, carried by a breeze that felt like a warm silk ribbon against the skin. Villisca was a sanctuary of safety, a town where keys were often left in locks and neighbors were as familiar as siblings. The town was peaceful, settled into the quiet satisfaction of a Sunday well spent, unaware that the ticking of the grandfather clocks in every parlor was counting down the final hours of an era of innocence. At the heart of this evening was the Presbyterian Church, a sturdy building where the light from the stained glass windows spilled onto the grass in puddles of deep amber and ruby red. Inside, the atmosphere was one of celebration. It was Children's Day, an annual event that brought the community together to witness the recitations and songs of the local youth. Sarah Moore, a woman of 39 years with a gentle smile and a tireless spirit, had spent weeks coordinating the program. She moved through the aisles, her long skirt rustling softly against the wooden floorboards, ensuring every ribbon was straight and every child felt brave. Her husband, Josiah, known to everyone as Joe, sat in the pews with their children. Joe was a successful businessman of 43, a man whose presence was as sturdy as the farm implements he sold at his store. Beside him were their 4 children: Herman, who was 11, Catherine, aged 10, Boyd, who was 7, and little Paul, only 5 years old. They were joined by 2 guests, the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ine, who were 12 and 8. The church was filled with the smell of floor wax, old hymnals, and the faint, sweet perfume of lily of the valley. The service was a tapestry of small, precious moments. Imagine the sound of high-pitched voices reciting verses from memory, the occasional stumble over a long word met with encouraging nods from the congregation. The heat in the room was palpable, softened only by the rhythmic fluttering of handheld fans made of cardboard and wood. As the program drew to a close around 9:30 in the evening, the air began to change. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, dark purple, and the first distant rumbles of a thunderstorm began to roll across the Iowa plains like heavy stones being dragged across a wooden floor. The light inside the church seemed warmer, more protective, against the encroaching gloom of the storm. When the final blessing was spoken, the families lingered, exchanging pleasantries and praise for the children's performances. The Moore family gathered their belongings, the children still buzzing with the excitement of the night, while Sarah shared a final few words with the other organizers. They had no way of knowing that this sanctuary of light and song would be their last collective memory of the world. The walk from the church to the house on 2nd Street was short, but the weather made it feel like a journey through another realm. A fine, misty rain had begun to fall, cooling the parched dust of the roads and turning the wooden sidewalks into slick, dark ribbons. Josiah led the way, perhaps tilting his head back to feel the cool droplets on his face, while Sarah walked with the girls, ensuring their Sunday dresses were tucked away from the damp. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ine, walked close to Catherine Moore, their laughter muffled by the heavy, humid air. The town was falling silent now, the lights in the windows of neighboring houses flickering out one by one as families retired to their beds. The only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of their boot heels on the planks and the soft, steady patter of the rain against the leaves of the maple trees. Shadows stretched long and distorted under the few streetlights, dancing against the white picket fences that lined the path. The Moore family moved as a single unit, a cluster of warmth and life, navigating the deepening blue of the Iowa night. When they reached the white frame house at the end of the street, it looked like any other home in Villisca, quiet, unassuming, and bathed in the soft gray light of the misty evening. The house stood 2 stories tall, its windows like dark eyes watching the street. Josiah reached for the door, the metal cool and wet in his hand. Inside, the air was still, holding the scent of the morning's breakfast and the faint, metallic tang of the wood stove. The house felt peaceful, yet there was a density to the silence within its walls. As they entered, the family began the quiet rituals of the night. Lamps were lit, casting long, wavering shadows that climbed the wallpaper. The children began to tire, their excitement fading into the heavy-lidded haze of sleep. They moved through the rooms with the practiced ease of those who felt entirely secure in their world. They did not look up at the ceiling, where the dark attic lay in total shadow. They did not hear the sound of a held breath or the soft shift of weight on the floorboards above. To the Moores, it was simply the end of a long, beautiful day. They climbed the stairs, the wood groaning softly under their weight, each step taking them further from the light of the church and deeper into the velvet embrace of a night that would never truly end. The sun rose over the hills of Iowa on Monday, June 10th, 1912, with a clarity that seemed almost cruel given the stillness that had settled over the white frame house on 2nd Street. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the heat was already beginning to shimmer against the wooden siding, promising another humid day in the heart of the Midwest. Mary Peckham, the Moores' next-door neighbor, was already well into her morning routine. She was a woman of habit, and her habits included noticing the rhythms of those around her. Usually, by this hour, the Moore household was a symphony of productivity. Josiah would be tending to the horses, the 4 children would be running across the grass with their morning energy, and Sarah would be moving about the kitchen, the scent of breakfast and the sound of clinking plates drifting through the open windows. But this morning, the house was a tomb of silence. There was no smoke curling from the chimney to meet the pale blue sky. The horses remained restless in the barn, their low whinnies and the rhythmic stamping of their hooves the only sounds in the heavy air. Mary stood on her own porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes fixed on the Moore residence. The stillness felt thick, like a physical weight pressing down on the neighborhood. It was not just quiet, it was a void. Driven by a growing sense of unease that she could not quite name, Mary walked across the damp grass, the dew soaking into the hem of her skirts. As she approached the Moore house, she noticed that every single curtain had been drawn tight. The windows, which were usually thrown open to catch the morning breeze, were sealed shut. She climbed the wooden steps of the porch, the boards creaking under her weight with a sound that felt startlingly loud in the vacuum of the morning. She knocked on the door. First, a polite rap, then a louder, more insistent pounding. There was no response. No heavy footsteps of Josiah coming to greet her, no high-pitched laughter of the children. Mary reached for the brass doorknob and turned it, but the mechanism held firm. The door was locked from the inside. She stepped back, her heart beginning to beat with a slow, rhythmic thud against her ribs. She moved to the side of the house, looking toward the chicken coop. The birds were agitated, trapped behind the wire. In a small act of normalcy to calm her nerves, Mary unlatched the coop, letting the chickens spill out onto the dirt. But as she watched them, her eyes kept returning to those darkened windows. She knew, with the intuition of a neighbor who had watched these lives for years, that something was terribly wrong. She hurried back to her own home and reached for the telephone, her fingers trembling as she asked to be connected to the drug store where Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, worked. Ross Moore arrived at the house around 8 o'clock. He was a man of business, practical and steady, but even he felt the oppressive atmosphere as he stepped onto the property. He joined Mary on the porch, his brow furrowed as he looked at the locked front door. He called out his brother's name, his voice echoing off the nearby houses, but the only answer was the distant whistle of a train. Ross reached into his pocket and pulled out his own set of keys. The metal felt cold and heavy in his palm. He selected the one for the front door, sliding it into the lock with a metallic click that seemed to vibrate through the wood. As the bolt slid back, the door didn't spring open. It yielded slowly, as if the air inside the house was heavier than the air outside. As the door swung wide, a wave of stale, stagnant air met them. It was a smell of old shadows and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. The parlor was bathed in a dim, gray light, filtered through the thick fabric of the drawn curtains. Dust motes danced in the single slivers of sunlight that managed to pierce the edges of the window frames. Everything appeared to be in its place, yet the very atmosphere of the room felt altered, as if the space had been claimed by something that did not belong there. Ross stepped inside, his boots thudding softly on the carpet, while Mary remained on the porch, her hands clasped tightly at her chest, her breath shallow. Ross moved through the parlor toward the back of the house, his eyes scanning the familiar furniture. In the kitchen, a plate of uneaten food sat on the table, a silent witness to a meal that would never be finished. Next to it, a bowl of water sat on the counter, the liquid tinged with a dark, reddish hue that Ross's mind refused to categorize. He turned toward the downstairs guest bedroom, the room where the Stillinger sisters, Inez and Lena, had been invited to stay after the church program. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. Ross pushed it open, the hinges giving a low, rusted groan. The room was even darker than the parlor. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the shapes of two bodies on the bed. They were perfectly still, covered by bedclothes that had been pulled up with a precision that was chilling. He reached out, his hand shaking, and pulled back the corner of the sheet. The sight that met him was a nightmare made manifest. The faces of the two young girls were gone, replaced by the horrific work of a heavy, sharp instrument. On the floor nearby, a kerosene lamp sat without its glass chimney, its wick turned low. And leaning against the wall, almost casually, was Josiah's own axe, the metal head dark and matted with evidence of the night's work. Ross didn't scream. The horror was too vast for sound. He simply turned, his face ashen, and walked back through the parlor, through the door, and out into the blinding, indifferent sunlight of the Iowa morning. Mary Peckham saw his face and knew. Before he could even speak, she saw the way his eyes looked through her, as if he were still seeing the shadows inside. Ross managed only a few words, his voice a ragged whisper. He told her to call the marshal, Henry Horton. He told her there were people dead in every bed. The news began to ripple outward from 2nd Street like a stone thrown into a still pond. Within an hour, the quiet town of Villisca would be changed forever. The news spread from the drug store to the post office, from the blacksmith to the banks, a growing murmur of disbelief that turned into a roar of panic. People began to gather near the white frame house, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They looked at the house they had walked past 1,000 times, now cordoned off by a dread that no one could fully grasp. Inside, the silence remained, thick and heavy, guarding the secrets of what had happened in the hours between midnight and dawn. The sun continued its climb, the heat of June 10th intensifying, baking the wood of the house and the dirt of the street, while inside, the cold reality of the tragedy began to settle into the very floorboards. The morning of peace had ended, and the long, dark shadow of the Villisca axe murders had only just begun to fall over the valley. The air inside the Moore house was not merely still. It was thick, heavy with a metallic, sweet scent that seemed to cling to the back of the throat and settle like a physical weight upon the chest. When Ross Moore turned his copy of the key in the front door, the wood groaned, a sharp, singular sound that felt like a scream in the oppressive, unnatural silence of that June morning. He stepped into the parlor, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards, each step a violation of the quiet. Beside him, Marshal Hank Horton moved with a cautious, practiced gait, his eyes scanning the dim corners of the room. As they approached the door to the downstairs guest bedroom, the smell grew stronger, a copper-tinged fog that signaled the end of the world they once knew. Behind that door, in the room where the young Stillinger sisters, Ine and Lena Gertrude, had sought a night of innocent sleep, the scene was one of impossible carnage. The girls lay beneath the heavy bed linens, their forms strangely motionless. But it was what leaned against the south wall of that room that drew the eye with a sickening, magnetic pull. The axe. It was a common household tool, a 2-pound implement Josiah kept in the backyard for the coal shed, but now it was a relic of nightmare. Its heavy iron head was matted with dark, drying blood and fine strands of hair, reflecting the dim morning light in a way that felt predatory. It sat there, patient and terrible, as if it were simply waiting for the next hand to grasp its worn wooden handle. The weight of the tragedy began to settle into the very foundations of the house, a pressure that seemed to make the white painted walls pulse with the memory of the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning. As they moved deeper into the house, a different kind of horror began to reveal itself, a quiet, calculated madness that went beyond the initial butchery. In every room where death had visited, the killer had performed a ritual that defied simple logic. Every mirror, every silvered, reflective surface that might have caught a glimpse of the carnage, was draped in fabric. In the downstairs bedroom, a thick blanket had been pulled over the glass, its folds hanging like a heavy, funeral curtain. Even the windows had been covered with clothing and linens pulled from the family's own dressers, shielding the interior from the prying eyes of the morning sun. It was as if the intruder could not bear to see what he had become in the silvered glass. Or perhaps he believed, as the old superstitions of the era suggested, that the mirrors must be blinded to prevent the souls of the 8 people he had just slaughtered from being trapped within the house forever. The darkness he had created was physical, a literal blinding of the home. The sight of those draped frames, standing like silent, faceless sentinels in the gloom, suggested a mind that was not just violent, but meticulously, hauntingly deliberate. He had stayed. After the work of the axe was done, he had walked through these rooms with a slow, steady hand, hanging those cloths as if he were tucking the house into a permanent, sightless sleep, ensuring that no reflection of his face would remain in the rooms where he had stolen so much life. The kitchen offered no reprieve from the strangeness of the killer's presence. On the table sat a plate of uneaten food, placed as if for a midnight snack, a grotesque domesticity in the heart of a tomb. Beside it stood a ceramic basin filled with water that had turned a murky, rusted red, the remains of the killer's final wash before he vanished into the pre-dawn shadows. He had taken his time, moving with an eerie, unhurried confidence. In the icebox, he had found a slab of bacon, and for reasons that would baffle investigators for over a century, he had carried a 2-pound portion of it into the bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay. He had wrapped the cold, fatty meat in a kitchen towel and left it on the floor, a bizarre offering or a cryptic signature left beside the murder weapon. Everywhere the marshal looked, the details grew more surreal. Kerosene lamps were found at the foot of the beds, their glass chimneys carefully removed and set aside on the floor, their wicks turned down so low they would have cast only the faintest, most ghostly amber glow. He had operated in the near darkness, guided by the rhythm of his own breathing and the heavy, repetitive thud of the iron against bone. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage, and he was a director who had spent hours perfecting the scenery of his atrocity, moving through the rooms like a ghost who had decided to become flesh for one terrible night. Upstairs, the slaughter had been even more relentless. In the master bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore had been struck with such ferocity that the ceiling above their bed bore deep, jagged gouges where the axe had swung upward in its terrible arc, biting into the plaster. The killer had not used the sharp edge for most of his work. Instead, he had turned the tool, using the blunt, heavy pole to crush the skulls of his victims. Each person had been struck 20 to 30 times, a repetitive mechanical violence that reduced their features to something unrecognizable. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, and little Paul Vernon, all had been found in their beds, their faces covered with their own bedclothes. The killer had pulled the sheets up over their heads after the deed was done, as if to hide the results of his work from the empty rooms. The repetition of the blows suggested a manic energy, a deep-seated rage that did not stop once life had fled. In one room, a single shoe belonging to Sarah had been knocked over, blood pooling inside the leather and staining the floor beneath, a tiny, domestic tragedy within the larger massacre. The silence of the upstairs was different from the parlor. It was the silence of a void, where the laughter of 4 children had been replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of the linens draped over their broken forms, and the faint smell of spent cigarettes that some said still lingered in the air of the attic above. By 8:40 in the morning, the secret of 508 East 2nd Street could no longer be contained by the locked doors. The town's central telephone office issued an all-call, a piercing, rhythmic alert that rang in every home across the small community of 2,000 souls. Within minutes, the quiet, dust-blown streets of Villisca were choked with people. The news spread like a wildfire fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. The Moors are dead, all of them. But the initial shock quickly curdled into a dangerous, chaotic curiosity. Before the marshal could secure the doors or establish a perimeter, dozens of townspeople pushed their way into the house, their muddy boots trampling over the footprints the killer had left behind in the kitchen. They crowded into the narrow hallways and peered into the bedrooms, some even reaching out to touch the blood-stained axe, or, in a fit of ghoulish hysteria, pocketing fragments of bone and blood-soaked wood as souvenirs. The crime scene was decimated in an hour, the forensic truth buried under the weight of 1,000 prying eyes and the heavy heat of the morning. Outside, the panic took a more defensive form. Men who had been neighbors for years now looked at one another with narrowed, suspicious eyes, wondering which of them had the strength to swing the iron. Shotguns were pulled from mantels, and doors that had never known a bolt in 20 years were locked and barred. The sun was high now, casting long, sharp shadows across the Iowa dirt, but for the people of Villisca, the darkness was only just beginning. They were no longer a community. They were a collection of frightened animals, waiting to see if the man with the axe was still among them, hidden behind a familiar face, or if he was already miles away, watching the sun rise on a world he had changed forever. While the morning of June 10th, 1912, was beginning to breathe life into the streets of Villisca, a small, unassuming man stood upon the platform of the railroad station. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the biting metallic tang of the iron tracks that stretched like silver ribbons into the gray horizon. It was 5:19 in the morning. The town was still. The heavy silence of the Moore household only a few blocks away remained undisturbed by the screams that would soon follow. This man, the Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, stood only 5 feet and 2 inches tall, a slight figure weighing barely 119 pounds. He looked more like a nervous bird than a bringer of darkness, his eyes darting toward the coming locomotive as the steam began to billow in great, white clouds against the dawn. As the engine groaned to a halt, a rhythmic huffing like the breath of a giant, Kelly climbed the metal steps into the passenger car. He carried with him a suitcase and a mind that he would later describe as filled with a strange, persistent whirring sound. The wood and velvet of the train car felt cold and damp under the morning mist, and as he settled into his seat, the town of Villisca began to recede, disappearing into the fog as the train began its slow, chugging departure toward the northwest. The rhythm of the rails was a hypnotic, steady beat, a clack-clack, clack-clack that echoed against the wooden walls of the carriage. For the other passengers, it was the sound of progress, of a journey beginning. But for Kelly, the atmosphere was charged with an electric, jagged tension. Sitting near him was an elderly couple, their faces weathered and kind, who would later testify to the peculiar behavior of the little minister. They noticed how his hands, small and pale, gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned the color of bone. The smell of coal smoke drifted through the vents, mixing with the stale scent of tobacco and old wool. It was during this journey, as the sun began to climb higher and cast long, distorted shadows across the Iowa cornfields, that Kelly reportedly leaned forward and spoke words that would haunt the investigation for years. He spoke of a great tragedy, a horrific slaughter that had occurred in the town they had just left. He whispered of 8 souls taken in the night, of a bloodbath that the world did not yet know existed. At that hour, the bodies of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters had not yet been discovered. They lay in the absolute stillness of their curtained home, draped in heavy bedclothes, while the man on the train spoke of their end as if he had been there to witness the final breath of every child. When the train arrived in the small town of Macedonia, Kelly went about his business with a frantic, disjointed energy. He was a traveling preacher, a man of the cloth who seemed to thrive on the fire and brimstone of the gospel, yet there was a shadow trailing him that no sermon could light. He visited a local laundry, handing over a bundle of clothing that would later become a focal point of the grand jury. Among the items was a shirt, stained with deep, rust-colored spots that the laundry workers noted with quiet curiosity. In those days, a man might cut himself shaving with a straight razor, or perhaps a nosebleed would mar a collar, but the marks on Kelly's linen seemed different, darker, more deliberate. Over the next several weeks, Kelly's obsession with the Villisca murders grew into a consuming fire. He did not retreat from the horror. He ran toward it. He returned to the town only a week after the burials, walking the streets and lingering near the house on 2nd Street. He even went so far as to pose as a detective from Scotland Yard, using a forged identity to gain entrance to the crime scene, standing in the very rooms where the blood had pooled on the floorboards, his eyes tracing the gouge marks in the plaster ceilings where the axe had swung high. 5 years passed. The initial terror of 1912 had settled into a low, aching thrum of unresolved grief for the people of Villisca. But the law had not forgotten the little minister with the wandering eyes. In 1917, the weight of suspicion finally collapsed upon him. Kelly was arrested and subjected to an interrogation that lasted through the dark reaches of the night, a marathon of questioning in a room that felt small and suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and cheap coffee. The investigators pushed, their voices low and gravelly, demanding the truth that had been hidden behind his clerical collar. Under the immense pressure of exhaustion and his own fractured psyche, Kelly began to speak. He described a voice, a divine, terrible command that had echoed in the hollows of his mind. He told them that God had spoken to him, saying, "Slay utterly." He described entering the house in the dead of night, the floorboards cold beneath his feet, and the heavy weight of the axe in his hand. He spoke of the children, saying he had sent them to heaven quickly. It was a confession that sent shivers through the legal community, a detailed, harrowing account of the slaughter delivered by a man who claimed he was merely a vessel for a higher, darker power. The trials that followed were a spectacle of high drama and psychological ruin. The courtroom in Red Oak was packed, the heat of the Iowa summer making the air feel like a physical weight against the skin of the spectators. Kelly sat at the defense table, looking smaller than ever, his defense team arguing that he was not a murderer, but a man deeply lost in the labyrinth of mental illness. They described him as a carload of nuts, a man who had confessed not because of guilt, but because his mind could no longer distinguish between his dark fantasies and reality. The prosecution pointed to his left-handedness, matching the angle of the axe blows and his presence on that early morning train. In the first trial, the jury remained deadlocked, 11-1 in favor of acquittal, the lone holdout convinced of his guilt but uncertain of his sanity. A second trial was swifter, ending in a full acquittal that allowed the Reverend to walk free. He vanished shortly after, slipping away into the fog of history, eventually dying in a mental institution many years later. He left behind a town that was no closer to the truth than it had been on that bloody Monday morning. The stranger on the train had taken his secrets with him, leaving the people of Villisca to wonder if the devil had truly sat among them on the 519 Express, or if the real monster was still out there, walking through the tall corn, waiting for the sun to set once more. The air in Villisca during that summer of 1912 was heavy, not just with the sweltering heat of the Iowa plains, but with a thick, suffocating layer of suspicion that seemed to settle in the lungs of every resident. As the initial shock of the murders began to transform into a cold, hardened need for answers, the town found itself splitting along old, jagged fault lines. Long before the axe had fallen in the darkness of that June night, there was a different kind of violence brewing in the town, a quiet, commercial warfare that pitted neighbor against neighbor. To understand the shadows that stretched across the Moore household, one must look at the towering figure of Senator Frank Fernando Jones. He was a man of immense gravity and even greater pride, a titan of local industry who had built an empire of farm implements and political influence. His hands, though clean of blood, were familiar with the levers of power, and he did not take kindly to those who dared to pull them in a different direction. For years, Josiah Moore had been his most trusted lieutenant, a man who understood the rhythm of the trade and the language of the farmers. But in 1908, that bond had snapped. Josiah had walked away from the shadow of the senator to open his own store, and in doing so, he had taken more than just his expertise. He had taken the prestigious John Deere plow contract, a jewel in the crown of the implement business that Frank Jones had cherished as his own. The rift was not merely professional. It was a wound that festered in the public eye. People whispered of how the two men would cross the street to avoid one another, their faces hardening into masks of granite whenever their paths inadvertently converged in the town square. There were darker rumors, too, whispers carried on the wind about an illicit connection between Josiah Moore and the senator's daughter-in-law. In a town as small as Villisca, such secrets were like dry tinder, waiting for a single spark to turn a rivalry into a conflagration. As the official investigation stalled, a new character stepped onto the stage, smelling of tobacco and the ink of old warrants. James Newton Wilkerson was a private detective from the Burns National Detective Agency, a man whose reputation was built on a relentless, almost fanatical devotion to the hunt. He arrived in Villisca not with a soft touch, but with the clatter of a storm. Wilkerson did not look at the blood-stained walls of the Moore house with the detached eye of a coroner. He looked at them through the lens of a grand conspiracy. He began to weave a narrative that the town, desperate for a villain they could name, was all too eager to consume. To Wilkerson, the murders were not the work of a wandering madman or a passing drifter, but a cold, calculated hit commissioned by a man with everything to lose. He spent his days in the quiet corners of drugstores and the hushed parlors of the disgruntled, gathering fragments of gossip and sharpening them into accusations. He spoke of Senator Jones as if he were a Borgia prince, a mastermind who had used his wealth to purchase the ultimate silence. The detective's obsession grew into a public spectacle. He would stand in the back of open-topped cars, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowds, patting the pocket of his heavy wool coat and claiming he held the documents that would send the senator to the gallows. The atmosphere was electric and dangerous. The town was now divided into two camps, those who stood by the senator, believing in the sanctity of his reputation, and those who followed Wilkerson into the dark, convinced that the town's wealthiest citizen had traded human lives for the preservation of his pride. Every glance exchanged in the post office became a silent interrogation, and the once peaceful nights were filled with the sound of doors being bolted and the rhythmic, anxious ticking of 1,000 clocks. But if Senator Jones was the architect in Wilkerson's theory, he needed a builder, a man capable of wielding the heavy iron of the axe with the cold precision the crime required. This search led the detective to a name that still carries a chill: William Mansfield, often known by the sinister moniker of Blackie. Mansfield was a man of the shadows, a laborer with a history that seemed to be written in the very same blood that had pooled on the floors of the Moore home. Wilkerson claimed that Mansfield was a cocaine-addicted killer, a man whose soul had been eroded by the dark underbelly of the Midwest. The detective pointed to a string of similar horrors that had occurred along the iron veins of the railroad, axe murders in Colorado Springs, in Ellsworth, and in Paula. In each of these cases, the details were hauntingly familiar. The faces of the victims were covered with cloth. The mirrors were shrouded as if to hide the crime from the eyes of the house itself, and the killer had lingered long enough to wash his hands in a basin of water left in the kitchen. Wilkerson was convinced that Mansfield was a traveler on the trains, a ghost who moved from town to town, leaving a trail of shattered families in his wake. In July of 1916, 4 years after the tragedy, the detective finally made his move. He tracked Mansfield down to a packing plant in Kansas City, where the smell of salt and raw meat hung heavy in the air. The arrest was a thunderclap. Mansfield was brought back to Iowa in irons, his presence a dark omen that the mystery was finally nearing its end. The interrogation rooms were dim, the air thick with the smell of sweat and the scratching of pencils as Wilkerson pushed and prodded, trying to force a confession from a man who seemed as impenetrable as the steel of the locomotives he allegedly rode. The spectacle of the grand jury was a masterclass in psychological tension. 100 witnesses were called, a long procession of citizens who brought with them their fears, their biases, and their half-remembered truths. Wilkerson presented his evidence with the flair of a playwright, painting a picture of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the state capitol. He showed the jury photographs of the crime scenes, the similarities in the ritualistic covering of the mirrors, and the presence of Mansfield in the vicinity of each tragedy. But as the case reached its crescendo, the foundation began to crumble under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. It was the payroll records of a company in Illinois that provided the final, cold clarity. They showed, in precise, dated entries, that William Mansfield had been hundreds of miles away, working a grueling shift at the time the axe was falling in Villisca. The grand jury, faced with the immutable truth of a time clock, refused to indict. The release of Mansfield was not a relief for the town, but a fresh wound. The theory that had sustained their hope for justice had vanished like smoke in a high wind. The senator, though legally untouched, found his life in ruins. His political career was a scorched field, and his neighbors looked at him not with respect, but with a lingering, poisonous doubt. He would live out the rest of his days in the very town that whispered his name in the dark, a pariah in a house of stone. As for Wilkerson, the man who had promised the truth, he found himself entangled in a web of slander suits and public disgrace. The dark theories had failed to light the way, leaving the town of Villisca to descend once more into a silence that was even more terrifying than the accusations. The killer, if it was not Mansfield, and if it was not a hireling of the senator, was still out there. A shadow without a name, a ghost who had mastered the art of the vanishing act. The year was 1917, and the heavy, humid air of the Iowa summer seemed to hang within the courtroom, thick with the scent of old wood, ink, and the collective breath of a town waiting for an end. The second trial of the Reverend George Kelly was reaching its final, quiet conclusion. After the chaos of the grand jury and the first trial that ended in a hung jury, the spectacle had begun to fray at the edges. The people of Villisca, who had once stood in the streets in hundreds, were tired. They were tired of the accusations, the private detectives with their polished shoes and suspicious eyes, and the shadow that had draped itself over their lives for 5 long years. When the verdict of not guilty was finally read, it did not arrive with a thunderclap. It was a soft sound, a sigh of finality that left more questions than answers. The Reverend, a small man whose mind had always seemed to wander through landscapes only he could see, walked free. He would eventually fade into the mist of the 1950s, passing away in a mental hospital on Long Island, carrying whatever truths he held into the silence of his own fractured memory. In the decades that followed, the town of Villisca began a slow, inevitable change. The population, once over 2,000, began to drift away, leaving behind the grand houses and the echoes of the railroad's golden age. But the house at 508 East 2nd Street remained. It stood as a white, wooden sentinel, watching the grass grow and the seasons turn from the bitter frosts of winter to the golden, heavy heat of August. It passed through the hands of 13 different owners over 90 years. Imagine the families who moved in, perhaps trying to fill the rooms with the sound of new laughter, only to find that the silence of June 10th, 1912, was a resilient thing. Some owners stayed only months, others stayed for years, adding layers of wallpaper and modern comforts, trying to bury the past beneath floral prints and electrical wiring. They added plumbing and enclosed the porches, pushing the 19th century farmhouse into a modern era that it never truly belonged to. Yet, despite the fresh paint and the new families, the story of the Moores and the Stillingers never truly left the soil. In 1994, a retired farmer named Darwin Lynn and his wife Martha took the keys to the property. They didn't see it as a home for themselves, but as a monument that needed to be unburdened of its secrets. They began a painstaking journey backward in time. With the careful hands of historians, they stripped away the vinyl siding to reveal the original wood, weathered and gray, that had seen the killer enter through the back door. They tore out the modern plumbing and the electrical fixtures, plunging the rooms back into the soft, flickering uncertainty of lamplight and shadow. They restored the outhouse and the chicken coop, recreating the world exactly as it was on that Sunday evening when the Moore family walked home from the Presbyterian church. When you stand in the house today, you are standing in a pocket of 1912. There is no hum of a refrigerator, no glow of a television. There is only the creak of the floorboards under your feet, a sound that feels like a whisper from Josiah or Sarah, or perhaps the light, running footsteps of Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul. The mystery remains as unfinished as the bowl of water found on the kitchen table that morning. We think of the suspects often. We think of Frank Jones, the powerful senator who lived out his days under a cloud of local suspicion that he could never quite scrub away, even after he won a libel suit against the detective who accused him. We think of William Mansfield, the man with the dark history and the solid alibi, and Henry Lee Moore, the serial killer who left a trail of similar tragedies across the Midwest. But as the years turn into a century, the faces of the suspects begin to blur, losing their features like old photographs left in the sun. What remains, sharp and clear, are the victims. We remember Lena and Inez Stillinger, the visiting sisters who were just supposed to be having a peaceful sleepover with their friends. We remember the Moore children, whose toys were found scattered on the floor, left exactly where they had fallen when the light was turned out for the last time. Their lives were not defined by the violence of their end, but by the love they shared in that small, white house on the edge of town. The shadows in the attic of the Moore house are long and still. When the wind moves through the trees outside, the leaves brush against the glass of the windows, a rhythmic, soothing sound that mimics the breath of the sleeping town. The story of Villisca is no longer a story of fear, but one of remembrance. It is a reminder that even in the face of the inexplicable, we seek to understand, to preserve, and to honor those who were lost. The axe is long gone, the trials are over, and the names of the witnesses have been carved into the quiet stones of the cemetery. The house stands in the moonlight, its white paint glowing softly, a silent witness to a night that will never be forgotten and a mystery that will never be solved. It is okay to let the questions go now. The air is cool, the world is quiet, and the house is finally at peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.